She whispered 5 words that would change everything. I can't feel my legs anymore. August 15, 1945, San Francisco Bay. The war had just ended, but for Yuki Matsuda, the battle was far from over. She lay in the medical hold of a military transport ship, her body broken. Her spine shattered, her legs, dead weight beneath thin blankets that smelled of salt and antiseptic. 23 years old, a nurse who had served the Japanese Imperial Army, and now technically a prisoner of the very nation she had been taught to fear. Through the porthole near her cot, she could see glimpses of America for the first time. The Golden Gate Bridge rose in the distance, its red towers catching the afternoon sun like beacons of another world. Buildings taller than any she had ever imagined stretched against the California sky. The air that drifted through the vents smelled different from anything she knew. It smelled of diesel and salt and something else, something she couldn't quite name, something clean, something alive, something untouched by the rot of war. For 8 months she had been in a prison camp in the Philippine jungle. The air there had smelled only of decay and death and human misery. The walls had been bamboo and barbed wire. The floor had been dirt crawling with insects. The sky had been obscured by a canopy of trees that blocked out the sun and trapped the heat like an oven. But that camp had not been run by Americans. That was the twist no one expected. The cruelty that had broken her spine had not come from the enemy she had been warned about. It had come from her own people, from Japanese soldiers driven mad by defeat who had turned their fury on anyone they considered a traitor, and nurses who had shown kindness to wounded prisoners who had followed medical ethics instead of blind nationalism were seen as the worst traitors of all. 2 American medics approached her cot, young men barely older than she was with kind faces and careful hands. One had freckles scattered across his nose. The other wore glasses that kept sliding down his face as he leaned over to check her vital signs. Neither of them looked like the monsters she had been warned about. Neither of them looked like devils. The one with freckles spoke to her slowly, as if she were a child or perhaps a frightened animal. We're going to move you now. Don't be afraid. We're not going to hurt you. She did not understand all the words, but she understood the tone. It was gentle. It was patient. It was nothing like what she had been told to expect from Americans. Nothing like the propaganda posters that had shown them as beasts with fangs and claws, creatures who tortured prisoners and showed no mercy. They lifted her onto a stretcher with such care that she almost cried. In the camp, she had been dragged by her hair across mud and stone. She had been kicked when she fell, beaten when she was slow punched, when she dared to look her captors in the eye. She had been beaten until her spine cracked like dry wood beneath the blows. But these men, these enemies, they touched her as if she were made of glass, as if she mattered, as if her pain meant something to them. As they carried her up to the deck, sunlight hit her face for the first time in months. She closed her eyes against the brightness, tears sliding down her temples and into her matted hair. The warmth felt foreign on her skin, almost painful after so long in darkness. She heard American voices all around her speaking in rapid English, laughing, sometimes their words blending into a river of sounds she could not navigate. She was in America. She was alive, and she had no idea what would happen next. The military hospital at Letterman General was a world unto itself. White walls stretched in every direction, so clean they almost hurt to look at. Nurses in crisp uniforms moved with quiet efficiency, their shoes clicking against floors that gleamed under fluorescent lights. The hallways smelled of disinfectant and fresh linen scents, so foreign to Yuki that they made her head spin. For a woman who had spent months sleeping on dirt floors infested with rats and insects, who had eaten rice crawling with weevils when there was rice at all, who had watched friends die of infections that could have been cured with basic medicine, the cleanliness was almost painful to witness. Every gleaming surface was an accusation. Every sterile corridor was a reminder of how completely her world had collapsed. They wheeled her through long corridors, past rooms filled with wounded American soldiers, young men with missing limbs, boys barely out of their teens with bandages wrapped around their heads, men who stared at the ceiling with empty eyes, their minds lost somewhere in the jungles and beaches of the Pacific. Some of them looked at her as she passed. A few looked away, their faces hardening. One young man missing his left arm below the elbow gave her a small nod. She did not know what to make of it. In the camp, she had been taught that Americans were devils, inhuman creatures who would show no mercy. But the devil, it seemed, had clean hospitals and gentle nurses. A doctor came to examine her within the first hour. He was an older man with gray hair cut short and thick glasses that magnified his eyes. His hands were large but steady, the hands of a man who had spent decades working with precision. He introduced himself as Dr. Samuel Morrison, Chief of Neurosurgery. A Japanese-American nurse translated his words, her accent a strange blend of both languages. Her name was Grace Kimura, born in California, raised speaking both English and Japanese. She had been brought in specifically to help with cases like Yuki's. "I'm going to examine your spine," Morrison said through Grace. "I need you to tell me if you feel anything, any sensation at all, even if it's just pressure or tingling." He ran his fingers along her back, pressing gently at different points. She felt pressure in her shoulders, a dull ache in her upper back, where old bruises still lingered. But below a certain point, there was nothing, just emptiness, a void where her body should have been. "I can't feel my legs," she whispered, the words catching in her glow. "I haven't felt them for 3 months. Not since—" She's trailed off, unable to finish, unable to speak about what had happened in that jungle camp, about the beating, about the wooden beam thick as her arm, about Sergeant Nakamura's dead eyes as he swung it again and again. Morrison's face remained calm, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. Concern, determination, perhaps even anger at what had been done to her. He turned to Grace and spoke rapidly in English. Grace's face went pale as she listened. Later, Yuki would learn what he had said. Her spine is fractured in at least 2 places. There's significant pressure on the spinal cord. Bone fragments appear to be embedded near the nerve tissue. If we don't operate, she'll never walk again. But if we do operate, the risks are enormous. She might die on the table. She might be left worse than she is now. Before any decisions about surgery could be made, they needed to stabilize her. She was severely malnourished, her body little more than skin stretched over bone. Her blood tests showed anemia, vitamin deficiencies, early signs of organ stress. The doctors estimated she had lost nearly a third of her healthy body weight. They moved her to a private room, a luxury she could not comprehend. Back in Japan before the war, hospital rooms had been shared among many patients. In the Philippine camp, there had been no rooms at all, just open-air shelters where the sick lay beside the dying. But here she had a room to herself. A real bed with clean sheets. A window that looked out over a courtyard filled with flowers. A nurse brought her a tray of food. Yuki stared at it as if it were a foreign object, something from another planet that had somehow materialized beside her bed. There was soup, thick and golden with chunks of real chicken floating in it. Steam rose from the bowl, carrying a smell so rich it made her stomach clench with desperate hunger. There was bread, soft and white, nothing like the moldy worm-infested scraps she had fought over in the camp. There was butter in a small dish, yellow and fresh, a substance she had not seen in over 2 years. There was a glass of milk, cold and fresh beads of moisture condensing on the outside. And there was a small bowl of fruit, sliced peaches swimming in sweet syrup, glistening under the soft lights like pieces of gold. The nurse was a young woman named Helen Carter, with brown hair pulled back in a neat bun and a gentle smile that seemed genuine. She helped Yuki sit up slightly, adjusting the pillows behind her back with careful hands. "You need to eat," Helen said gently, her voice carrying genuine concern. "You need your strength for what's ahead." She placed the spoon in Yuki's trembling hand. Yuki lifted the spoon with hands that shook so badly she could barely control them. The soup was warm and salty, and it tasted like nothing she had ever experienced. Not just food, but hope. Not just nourishment, but mercy. In the camp, soup had been dirty water, with a few grains of rice, maybe some scraps of vegetables that had already begun to rot. This was real food. This was sustenance. This was life itself poured into a bowl. She ate slowly, tears streaming down her face. She could not stop them, no matter how hard she tried. Every bite reminded her of the friends she had watched starve to death. Every swallow was a betrayal of those who had not survived. She thought of Haruko, the young nurse who had died in her arms whispering about the rice balls her mother used to make. She thought of Sachiko, who had given away her own rations to the sicker patients until she herself grew too weak to stand. She thought of all the women who would never taste food like this, never feel the simple comfort of a warm meal. And yet she ate, because her body demanded it, because some deep instinct for survival refused to let her stop, because somewhere beneath the guilt and the grief she wanted to live. Helen sat beside her throughout the meal, not speaking, just present, a quiet witness to her grief. When Yuki finally put down the spoon, her stomach fuller than it had been in months, the nurse squeezed her hand. "You're safe now," she said. "Whatever happened before, it's over. You're safe." Yuki did not know the English word for safe, but she understood the meaning. She understood it in the warmth of Helen's hand, in the softness of her voice, in the simple act of sitting beside a broken enemy and offering comfort. For the first time in months, perhaps for the first time since the war began, she believed it might be true. Over the next several days, Dr. Morrison and his team ran every test available to them. The x-rays revealed the full extent of the damage, and it was worse than anyone had feared. Yuki's spine had been fractured in two places, once at the lower thoracic vertebrae, around the area where the ribs connect to the spine, and once at the lumbar region in the lower back. Bone fragments had scattered from the impact of the blows, some of them now pressing against her spinal cord like shrapnel. Scar tissue had formed around the injuries over the 3 months since the beating, making everything more complicated. The wounds had begun to heal, but they had healed wrong. The beating she had endured had been systematic, brutal, designed by men who knew exactly how to cause maximum pain without immediate death. They had wanted her to suffer. They had wanted her to live with that suffering. They had nearly gotten their wish. The medical team gathered for a conference in a wood-paneled room on the 3rd floor. 12 doctors sat around a long mahogany table, x-rays clipped to light boards on the walls, casting skeletal shadows across the room. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. These were serious men with serious faces, and the questions before them had no easy answers. "The surgery is extremely risky," said Dr. Mercer, the head of anesthesiology. He was a small man with a worried face and fingers stained yellow from tobacco. "She's severely malnourished. Her body is weak. Her blood pressure is unstable. She may not survive the anesthesia alone, let alone 19 hours of surgery." Another doctor, a younger man named Phillips, who specialized in orthopedics, shook his head firmly. "But if we don't try, she'll be paralyzed for life. She's 23 years old. She has potentially 50 years ahead of her. Are we really going to condemn her to a wheelchair without even trying?" "The odds of success are extremely low," Mercer countered, "and the odds of making things worse are high. We could damage the spinal cord further. We could leave her unable to breathe on her own. We could kill her on the operating table." The debate continued for nearly an hour. Arguments flew back and forth. Statistics were quoted. Risks were weighed. Through it all, Dr. Morrison listened in silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes fixed on the x-rays that showed the ruins of Yuki's spine. Finally, he stood and walked to the light board. He traced the outline of Yuki's broken vertebrae, with his finger following the jagged lines of fracture, the scattered fragments, the compressed nerves. "She's a prisoner of war," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the noise. "She was an enemy. She served in the army that attacked us at Pearl Harbor. Some would say we owe her nothing. Some would say we should let her lie there and suffer the consequences of her nation's choices." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then he turned to face his colleagues. "But she's also a human being, a young woman who was beaten nearly to death by her own people for reasons we may never fully understand. She didn't break her own spine. She didn't choose to be paralyzed. She is a victim just like the boys in our wards who lost their limbs on Iwo Jima and Okinawa." His voice grew stronger, more passionate. "If we have the skill to help her, if we have the knowledge and the tools and the training, then don't we have the obligation to try? Isn't that what medicine is supposed to be? Healing without judgment, compassion without borders." The room was silent. Cigarettes burned down to ash and forgotten ashtrays. Then one by one the doctors nodded, some reluctantly, some with conviction, but they all agreed they would operate. They would give this broken woman a chance to walk again. They would show her what American medicine and American humanity could accomplish. The days before the surgery were filled with careful, methodical preparation. Nothing was left to chance. Yuki was given blood transfusions to strengthen her weakened body. Pint after pint of donated blood flowing into her veins, rebuilding what starvation had stolen. She was fed 4 times a day. Small meals designed to rebuild her strength without overwhelming her shrunken stomach. Protein-rich broths, Scrambled eggs, soft as clouds. Fruit juices, thick with vitamins. Each meal was calculated, measured, designed to give her body the fuel it would need to survive what lay ahead. Nurses checked on her every hour, monitoring her vital signs, adjusting her IV drips, turning her carefully to prevent bed sores. They bathed her with warm water and gentle hands. They brushed her hair, which had become tangled and matted from months of neglect. They applied ointment to the sores on her skin, the places where bone pressed against flesh, with nothing in between. Every detail mattered. Every small act of care was preparation for the battle ahead. Dr. Morrison visited her every morning. He would pull up a chair beside her bed, remove his glasses, and explain what was happening in simple terms that Grace could convey. He never rushed. He never seemed impatient. He treated her questions with the same seriousness he would have given to any patient, regardless of nationality. "We're going to repair your spine," he explained during one of these visits. "We're going to remove the bone fragments that are pressing on your nerves. We're going to try to give you back what was taken from you. It will be a long surgery, probably the longest of your life. But when you wake up, if everything goes well, you will begin to feel your legs again." Yuki listened carefully to the translation, her dark eyes never leaving the doctor's face. She understood the risks. She understood that she might die. She also understood that living as she was unable to move, unable to feel trapped in a body that had become her prison, was not really living at all. It was merely existing, and she had not survived the camp just to exist. "I want to try," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but her eyes were steady, filled with a determination that had somehow survived everything that had been done to her. "Even if I die, I want to try. I would rather die reaching for something than live without hope." Dr. Morrison nodded slowly. "Then we'll give you our best. Every doctor in this hospital will fight for you. You have my word." The night before the surgery, Yuki could not sleep. She lay in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the hospital at night. Footsteps in the corridor, the murmur of voices at the nurses' station, the soft beep of machines monitoring patients in other rooms. Outside her window, San Francisco glittered with lights, a city untouched by bombs, living its life as if the war had been something that happened far away to other people. Street lamps cast long shadows across the courtyard. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn honked. Normal life, peaceful life, a life she might never be part of. She thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. She thought about her mother in Japan, who did not know if her daughter was alive or dead, who might be sitting in the ruins of Osaka at this very moment praying for news that would never come. The letters Yuki had tried to send had disappeared into the chaos of war's end. For all her mother knew, her only daughter had vanished into the Philippine jungle and would never return. She thought about the friends she had lost in the camp, the nurses who had died in her arms, the women whose names would never be remembered by anyone but her. Haruko, who had been so young, barely 20, with dreams of opening a clinic in her village after the war, who had given away her last handful of rice to a woman dying of dysentery, then collapsed 3 days later, too weak to stand. Sachiko, who had sung lullabies to the sick women at night, her voice the only beauty in that terrible place, who had developed pneumonia in the monsoon rains and died whispering about her mother's cooking, about hot miso soup and fresh rice balls wrapped in seaweed. Keiko Fumiko Akane. Names and faces that haunted her dreams. Women who had shown such courage in the face of cruelty, who had maintained their humanity when everything around them was designed to strip it away. She thought about Sergeant Nakamura, the man who had broken her spine. She wondered if he was still alive somewhere, hiding in the jungle, or if the war had claimed him too. She tried to hate him, tried to summon the rage that should have been her right, but she was too tired for hatred. Too broken. All she felt was a vast, aching emptiness. Around midnight, there was a soft knock on her door. Nurse Helen entered, carrying a small cup of tea. Steam rose from it in delicate spirals, carrying the scent of chamomile and honey. "I thought you might be awake," she said, her voice gentle in the darkness. She sat down beside the bed and they shared the tea in silence. Two women from opposite sides of a war, connected by something that transcended politics and nationality. The tea was warm and sweet, coating Yuki's throat with comfort she had not known existed anymore. Finally, Helen asked the question that hung between them. "Are you afraid?" Yuki considered the question carefully before answering, waiting for Grace's translation to form in her mind, finding the English words she had been learning. Yes, she admitted, but not of dying. Death would be a release. I have been close to death so many times that it no longer frightens me. She paused, searching for the right words. I am afraid that I will survive and never walk again. I am afraid of being a burden, of spending the rest of my life trapped in a body that cannot move. I am afraid of living half a life of watching the world go on around me while I lie still. Helen took her hand and held it firmly. Her fingers were warm, calloused from years of nursing work, strong and certain. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said, you are not alone. Every person in this hospital is rooting for you. We will be with you every step of the way. Whether that step is taken on your feet or in your heart. As dawn broke over San Francisco, painting the hospital windows gold and pink and orange, Yuki closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. It was a prayer for strength, for courage, for the doctors who would hold her life in their hands. And somewhere in the deepest part of her heart, it was a prayer of gratitude. Gratitude for enemies who had become healers. Gratitude for kindness she had never expected to receive. Gratitude for the simple fact that she was still alive to see another sunrise. At 6 in the morning, they came for her. 2 orderlies transferred her carefully onto a gurney, their movements practiced and precise. The wheels squeaked slightly as they began to roll a sound that would forever be etched in her memory. The nurses who had cared for her over the past weeks walked beside her as she was wheeled through the corridors, their faces a mixture of hope and fear. Some of them touched her hand as she passed. One whispered, "Good luck." Another said simply, "We'll be here when you wake up." The fluorescent lights passed overhead like frames of a film, each one marking another step toward the unknown. Yuki kept her eyes open, watching everything, memorizing every detail. The way the light reflected off the polished floors, the smell of antiseptic growing stronger as they approached the surgical wing, the sound of her own heartbeat, steady but fast, counting down the seconds until her fate would be decided. The operating room was larger than she had imagined. Bright surgical lights hung from the ceiling like mechanical suns focused on a narrow table in the center of the room. Machines surrounded the table, beeping and humming with electronic life. Trays of surgical instruments gleamed on metal stands. Scalpels and clamps and retractors lined up like silver soldiers waiting for battle. The room was cold, deliberately so, and Yuki shivered beneath the thin sheet that covered her. 12 doctors and nurses filled the room, each one gowned and gloved, each one focused on the task ahead. They moved around her like dancers in a strange, solemn ballet, checking equipment, reviewing charts, speaking in low voices. This was her army, Yuki realized. Her army of healers gathered to fight for her life. Dr. Morrison appeared at her side. He was dressed in green surgical scrubs, a mask hanging around his neck, a cap covering his gray hair. His eyes, visible above everything else, were calm and steady. "We're ready," he said through Grace, who stood nearby. "The entire team is prepared. We've reviewed every detail planned for every possibility. Are you ready?" Yuki looked at this American man who had no reason to care about her, who owed her nothing, who had chosen to dedicate 19 hours of his life to giving her back hers. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "I am ready." The anesthesiologist, a kind-faced man named Dr. Mercer, with gentle hands, placed a mask over her face. She could smell something sweet and chemical, could feel it beginning to cloud her thoughts. "Count backward from 10, he said. "When you wake up, the hard part will be over." She began to count, her voice muffled by the mask. 10. The world grew soft around the edges. 9. The bright lights faded to a gentle glow. 8. The sounds of the operating room became distant, like voices heard through water. 7. She thought of her mother. 6. She thought of her friends who had died. 5. She thought of Helen's warm hand. And then there was nothing but darkness, peaceful and complete. The surgery began at 6:47 in the morning. What followed was a medical marathon, a test of endurance and skill and determination that would push every person in that room to their absolute limits. Dr. Morrison made the first incision at 6:52, a long, precise cut down the center of Yuki's back. Layer by layer, the team worked their way through muscle and tissue, approaching the damaged spine with the care of archaeologists uncovering a priceless artifact. What they found was worse than even the X-rays had shown. The fractures had healed poorly over the 3 months since the beating. Bone fragments were scattered like shrapnel around the spinal cord. some of them having actually begun to fuse in wrong positions, creating a maze of bony growths that pressed against nerves from multiple angles. Scar tissue had formed a thick, fibrous web tangled around nerve bundles that were barely functioning. Infection had set in at multiple points, creating pockets of inflammation that added to the pressure on. It was not just damage, it was devastation. The work of men who had wanted to destroy, rendered in bone and tissue and blood. "This is going to take longer than we thought," Dr. Morrison said quietly, his voice calm despite the challenge before him. "Much longer." Everyone settled in. The team adjusted their positions, prepared for the long haul. Hour after hour, they worked with meticulous precision. Bone fragments were removed one by one, each extraction requiring delicate maneuvering to avoid further damage to the already compromised spinal cord. A single slip, a single moment of carelessness could sever nerves that might otherwise be saved. Scar tissue was carefully cut away, revealing the healthy tissue beneath. Infected areas were cleaned with antiseptic solutions, treated with antibiotics drained of the poison that had accumulated over months of neglect. Every movement was calculated. Every cut was deliberate. The doctors spoke in low murmurs, coordinating their efforts, passing instruments back and forth with the efficiency of a well-trained orchestra. Outside the operating room, Helen Carter stood at the nurse's station, updating Yuki's chart, monitoring the surgery's progress through periodic reports from the surgical team. She had not left her post since the surgery began. Other nurses came and went, starting shifts, ending shifts, but Helen remained, waiting, praying in her own way. At the 10-hour mark, she noticed a figure in a wheelchair approaching down the corridor. Sergeant Robert Miller. He had not been near this wing of the hospital since his confrontation with Dr. Morrison days earlier. But now he wheeled himself slowly toward the nurse's station, his face unreadable. 3 days before the surgery, that confrontation had happened. Miller had wheeled himself to Morrison's office, jaw set, determined to argue against wasting resources on the enemy. But Morrison had told him something that changed everything. About a brother who died at Pearl Harbor. About choosing to heal instead of hate. And 2 days ago, when the call went out for O-negative blood donors, Miller had sat in his room for an hour wrestling with himself. Then he had wheeled down to the blood donation center. The nurse had looked surprised. "Sergeant Miller, are you sure this blood is for—" "I know who it's for," he had said, cutting her off. "Just do it before I change my mind." As his blood flowed into the collection bag, dark red life itself, Miller thought about Tommy Jensen bleeding out on Okinawa. Thought about Morrison's brother at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Thought about all the men who would never donate blood again because the war had taken everything. And he thought, maybe this is how we win. Not by taking more blood, but by giving our own. When it was done, he had wheeled to Yuki's room while she slept and left the flag pin on her bedside table. No note, no explanation, just a small piece of metal that said, "Even enemies can stop being enemies." "How long has it been?" he asked, his voice gruff. Helen checked her watch. 10 hours and 12 minutes. Miller nodded slowly. He stared at the closed doors of the operating room as if he could see through them, as if he could witness the battle being fought inside. "She's strong," he said finally. "She'll make it." Helen looked at him surprised. This was the man who had argued against Yuki's treatment, who had called her the enemy, who had been so full of rage. "Sergeant Miller," she said carefully, "I heard what you did, the blood donation." His jaw tightened. "Don't make a big deal out of it." "It was a big deal," Helen said softly. "It was everything." Miller was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A pin, an American flag from his uniform. "When she wakes up," he said, "if she wakes up, give her this. Tell her—" He paused, struggling with the words. "Tell her it's for luck. Tell her even enemies can stop being enemies." He placed the pin on the counter and wheeled away before Helen could respond. She picked up the small pin, feeling its weight in her palm. Such a tiny thing. But in that moment, it felt like the weight of reconciliation itself. The weight of a man choosing forgiveness over hatred. The weight of healing that went beyond medicine. Inside the operating room, the 12th hour arrived. The team had made significant progress, but the most critical phase was just beginning. They had reached the deepest bone fragments, the ones closest to the spinal cord itself. This was the moment that would determine whether Yuki would ever walk again. The bone fragments had to be removed without touching the delicate neural tissue. One wrong move, one slip of the scalpel, one tremor of an exhausted hand, and she would be paralyzed forever. Or worse. Dr. Morrison, who had been operating for most of the day with only brief breaks, refused to hand over this task. His hands, despite the hours of work, were steady as stone. His focus was absolute, his concentration so complete that he seemed to have entered another state of being entirely. The room fell silent except for the beeping of the heart monitor. Steady and reassuring, a metronome counting the moments of Yuki's life. Seconds stretched into minutes. The surgical team held their breath. Morrison's hands moved with precision that bordered on artistic. Micro movements, tiny adjustments, the tip of the scalpel navigating through scar tissue and bone with the delicacy of a painter, adding the final touches to a masterpiece. And then with a precision that seemed almost miraculous, he freed the spinal cord from its prison of bone and scar tissue. The final fragment came away cleanly, and for the first time in months, the neural pathway was clear. A nurse gasped audibly. "Dr. Morrison," she said, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "Her right toe. It just moved." The room erupted in cautious celebration. It was not proof of complete success, not yet. But it was hope. Real, tangible, miraculous hope. Morrison allowed himself a rare smile visible even behind his surgical mask through the crinkles around his eyes. "Keep going," he said. "We're not done yet. There's still work to do." The surgery continued for another 7 hours. The team reinforced Yuki's spine with metal rods anchoring the damaged vertebrae so they could heal properly. They fused sections of bone that had been too badly damaged to repair. They closed the incision layer by layer, stitching muscle and skin with painstaking care, ensuring that every thread was placed perfectly. The afternoon sun that had been bright when they began had set, risen again, and was beginning to set once more. The windows of the operating room glowed with the orange and pink of another evening. 19 hours, 12 doctors, countless prayers, one patient, one chance. At 1:43 in the morning, Dr. Morrison stepped back from the table and removed his surgical mask. His face was gray with exhaustion. Deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. His hands, steady throughout the entire 19-hour procedure, were finally trembling. He looked at the monitors, at the steady heartbeat displayed on the screen, at the young woman who had survived against all odds. "It's done," he said, his voice hoarse from hours of concentration. "We've done everything we can. Now we wait. Now we pray. Now we let her body do the rest." Yuki was moved to the intensive care unit where a dedicated team of nurses monitored her around the clock. She remained unconscious for nearly 36 hours, her body fighting to recover from the trauma of surgery. The doctors took turns sitting with her, checking her vitals, watching for any sign of complications. They had done everything medicine could do. The rest was up to Yuki, to her will to live, to whatever force guides the universe toward healing. Morrison did not leave the hospital. He slept in a chair in the doctor's lounge for a few hours, then returned to check on her. He studied her charts. He examined the post-operative x-rays. He waited. Helen Carter was there when Yuki finally opened her eyes. It was late afternoon, soft light filtering through the window, casting golden rectangles across the floor. Helen had been reading quietly in the chair beside the bed, and she noticed immediately when Yuki's breathing changed when her eyelids began to flutter. "Yuki," she said softly, leaning forward. "Can you hear me?" Yuki's eyes opened slowly, struggling to focus. The world was blurry, distant, as if she were looking at it through water. Her throat was dry, scratchy from the tube that had been removed hours before. Helen held a cup of water to her lips, and Yuki sipped slowly, feeling the coolness spread through her parched body. Then she remembered. The surgery, the operating room, the mask over her face, the countdown, and most importantly, her legs. The question formed in her mind before she could speak it. Her eyes found Helen's, desperate, terrified of the answer. Helen understood immediately. She reached for the call button, pressed it urgently. "Let me get Dr. Morrison," she said. "He'll want to be here for this." Morrison arrived within minutes, looking disheveled but alert. He had been reviewing surgical notes in his office, unable to truly rest until he knew the outcome. Grace Kimura came with him, ready to translate. He pulled up a chair on the other side of Yuki's bed, removed his glasses, cleaned them with a handkerchief, his thinking gesture. Then he put them back on and looked at her directly. "Welcome back," he said, and Grace translated. His voice was warm, But Yuki could hear the exhaustion beneath it, could see the toll that 19 hours had taken on this man who had fought so hard for her. "Can you feel anything?" he asked gently through Grace. "Take your time. Don't force it. Just try to move your toes." Yuki closed her eyes and concentrated. She thought about her feet, about her toes, about the connection between her brain and her body that had been severed for so long. She imagined the neural pathways as roads broken and damaged, now slowly being rebuilt. She pushed with everything she had, sending the signal from her mind down through her spine, through the repaired nerves all the way to her feet. And then she felt it. A tingling sensation in her right foot, faint and distant like a whisper from another room, but unmistakable, real, alive. She tried again harder this time, focusing all her will on that single point. Her big toe moved, just slightly, just a fraction of an inch, but it moved. "I felt it," she whispered, tears streaming down her face like rivers breaking through a dam. "I felt my toe move. I can feel my foot." Dr. Morrison bowed his head. For a moment she thought he was praying, then she realized he was crying. This American doctor, this man who had spent 19 hours fighting for her life, who had poured everything he had into saving a woman who was technically his enemy, was weeping with joy. "You're going to walk again," he said, his voice breaking. "It will take time. It will take work. There will be pain and frustration and days when you want to give up. But you're going to walk again. I promise you." Helen Carter was crying too, holding Yuki's hand, squeezing it tightly. Grace Kimura translated through her own tears, her voice thick with emotion. And Yuki, lying in that hospital bed with sensation returning to her legs for the first time in 3 months, understood something profound. The enemy she had been taught to fear had given her back her life. The monsters from the propaganda posters had shown her more humanity than her own people. The devil's mercy was real, and it was stronger than any weapon, more powerful than any bomb, more lasting than any victory won on a battlefield. She had come to America expecting death. Instead, she had found something far more dangerous to the machinery of war, far more subversive to the logic of hatred. She had found compassion without borders, healing without judgment, love that transcended nationality. And in that moment, lying in that clean hospital bed with sunlight streaming through the window and tears on her cheeks and sensation returning to her broken body, Yuki Matsuda understood that the war was truly over. Not because the shooting had stopped, not because treaties had been signed, but because mercy had won. The months that followed were filled with grueling rehabilitation. Every day, physical therapists worked with Yuki, teaching her muscles to remember what they had forgotten. They started with the simplest movements, things that healthy people take for granted: wiggling her toes, flexing her feet, bending her knees. Each small victory was celebrated. Each setback was met with renewed determination. There were days when she wanted to give up, days when the pain was so intense she screamed into her pillow, biting down on the fabric to keep from disturbing other patients. Days when her legs refused to cooperate, when her muscles spasmed and cramped, when progress seemed impossible. But the nurses were always there, Helen especially, encouraging her, pushing her, refusing to let her quit. And Dr. Morrison visited her every week, tracking her progress, adjusting her treatment, reminding her of how far she had come. "Do you remember that first day?" he would ask, "when you couldn't feel anything below your waist, when you thought you would never walk again?" And Yuki would nod, remembering that darkness, that emptiness, that void where her body should have been. "Look at you now," Morrison would say, his eyes bright with pride. "Look at what you've accomplished." By the 3rd month, she could sit up on her own, could transfer to a wheelchair with minimal assistance, could feel sensation throughout both legs, though the strength was still building, still tentative, still fragile. By the 5th month, she could stand with support, could bear her own weight for 30 seconds, then a minute, then 5 minutes. Her legs trembled like a newborn foal's, but they held. During those long months of rehabilitation, something unexpected happened. Sergeant Robert Miller became a regular visitor. At first, he would simply wheel past her room, glancing in, saying nothing. Then he started nodding when their eyes met. Then he started stopping in the doorway. One afternoon, he wheeled himself fully into her room. Grace Kimura was there, helping Yuki with language lessons, teaching her more English words, basic phrases, simple conversations. "Mind if I sit?" Miller asked, gesturing to the chair by the window. Yuki nodded uncertain, still remembering Helen's story about his opposition to her treatment. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Miller spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I gave you that pin," he said, pointing to the small American flag that sat on her bedside table, the one she had kept close since waking up. "Don't know if they told you why." Grace translated carefully, watching both of their faces. "I was angry," Miller continued. "Real angry. Lost my leg fighting your people. Lost friends, good men. Boys who should have lived to be old men, should have gone home to their families, should have had whole lives ahead of them." He paused, his hand unconsciously moving to his left leg to the space where it ended below the knee. "I thought you didn't deserve help. Thought we should let you suffer. Seemed fair, eye for an eye." Yuki listened, her English still limited, but understanding enough. Understanding the pain in his voice, the struggle. "But Dr. Morrison told me something. About his brother at Pearl Harbor. About choosing to heal instead of hate. And I realized something." Miller looked directly at her now, his eyes meeting hers. "We can't get back what the war took. My leg, your spine, all those boys who died. My buddy Tommy Jensen, who bled out in my arms on Okinawa. Your friends in that camp. None of them are coming back." His voice cracked slightly. "But we can choose what we do next. We can stay angry, stay broken, let the war keep killing us slowly from the inside. Or we can—" He trailed off, struggling for words. "We can what?" Yuki asked in careful English, her first full sentence directed at him. Miller smiled, a sad smile, but genuine. "We can try to be better than the war, better than the hate. That's what Dr. Morrison did. That's what you're doing, working so hard to walk again. That's what I'm trying to do." He reached out his hand across the space between them. "Truce?" he asked. Yuki looked at his hand, thought about everything it represented. An American soldier, a man who had fought against her country, a man who had lost so much to the war. And she took it. "Truce," she said, the English word feeling strange on her tongue, but the meaning clear in her heart. They shook hands, these two former enemies, both wounded by the same war, both learning the same lesson. That healing was harder than fighting. That forgiveness took more courage than vengeance. That peace was built one handshake at a time, one connection at a time, one choice at a time. From that day forward, Miller visited regularly. He and Yuki would sit together in the rehabilitation room, working on their respective therapies. Him learning to walk on his prosthetic leg, her learning to walk on legs that were slowly remembering their purpose. They became an unlikely pair. The Japanese nurse and the American sergeant, both broken by war, both refusing to stay broken. 8 months after the surgery, Yuki stood for the first time without support. It was a Tuesday morning in April, the cherry trees in the courtyard outside just beginning to bloom. Helen had arranged for several nurses to be present, and Dr. Morrison had cleared his schedule to be there. Miller wheeled himself into position at the far end of the parallel bars, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair, his face tense with anticipation. Yuki stood at the near end, her arms shaking with effort as she gripped the parallel bars, her legs trembling beneath her, like branches in a strong wind. "You can do this," Morrison said from beside her, his voice calm and confident. "One step at a time. Don't think about the distance. Think about the next step. Just the next step." Yuki looked at the distance between her and Miller. Perhaps 10 feet, the length of the parallel bars. It might as well have been 1,000 miles. But she thought about everything she had survived. The beatings in the jungle. The months of paralysis lying in her own waist, unable to move, waiting to die. The 19-hour surgery where 12 doctors had fought for her life. The endless rehabilitation, the pain, the setbacks, the moments when giving up seemed easier than continuing. If she could survive all of that, she could walk 10 feet. She took a breath, released her grip on the bars, and she took a step. Her right foot moved forward, wobbly, uncertain, but determined. Then her left foot, then her right again. The room was absolutely silent except for the shuffle of her feet on the floor and the rapid beating of her own heart. She did not look down at her feet. She kept her eyes fixed on Miller, on the man who had once hated her, who now waited for her with encouragement on his face. Step by step, inch by inch, she made her way toward him. On the 7th step, her left leg buckled. She started to fall forward, her arms windmilling, trying to catch herself. Helen rushed forward to help, but Yuki's voice stopped her. No, she said firmly in English, one of the words she had practiced endlessly. I do myself. She caught herself on the bars, her arms straining to hold her weight. Her legs shook violently beneath her. Every muscle screamed for her to give up, to accept help, to make it easier. But she had not come this far to make it easier. She straightened slowly, painfully, forcing her legs to support her weight again. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Her breath came in short gasps. But she did not stop. Step 8, right foot forward. Step 9, left foot forward. Step 10, right foot forward, and she was there standing before Miller, her legs shaking but holding. She collapsed forward and Miller caught her, his strong arms wrapping around her, supporting her weight. The room erupted in applause. Helen was crying, Grace was crying. Even Morrison's eyes were wet with tears he did not try to hide. But Yuki barely heard them. All she knew was the strength of the arms holding her up, the wetness of tears on her cheeks, and the impossible, wonderful truth. She was walking. Thank you, she said into Miller's shoulder, the English words still awkward on her tongue, but filled with more feeling than any words she had ever spoken. Thank you for not give up on me. Miller held her gently, his own tears falling freely now. You never gave up on yourself, he said, his voice thick. We just helped you find your way back. Later that afternoon, alone in her room, Yuki looked at herself in the mirror that hung on the wall. It was the first time she had really studied her reflection since arriving at Letterman General. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her face had filled out, no longer hollow and skeletal. Her eyes were bright, no longer dulled by pain and despair. Her hair, once matted and lifeless, now shone with health, pulled back in a simple style Helen had taught her. And she was standing on legs that had been dead, that had been written off, that had been beaten into submission by men who wanted to destroy her. She stood in front of that mirror for a long time, studying her reflection, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The war, the camp, the beating, the voyage to America, the surgery, the rehabilitation. All of it had led here to this woman standing on her own 2 feet alive against all odds. And she realized then that the greatest wound had not been to her spine. It had been to her spirit. She had been taught to hate these people, to fear them, to see them as less than human. The propaganda had painted them as monsters, as devils, as creatures beyond redemption. But they had shown her more humanity than her own people ever had. They had stitched her back together, body and soul, with patience and compassion and an unwavering belief in her worth as a human being. The propaganda had been a lie. The hatred had been a prison as confining as any cage of iron bars. And the key to her freedom had been carried by the very people she was supposed to despise. They had not conquered her with weapons. They had conquered her with kindness. And that victory was far more profound, far more lasting than any battle won on a field of blood. When the war officially ended and the paperwork was finalized, Yuki faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could stay in America, in the land of her former enemies, among the people who had saved her. Several of the doctors and nurses had offered to help her build a new life here. Dr. Morrison had even spoken to colleagues about finding her a position at a hospital in California once she completed her rehabilitation. America offered safety, opportunity, a fresh start, a life without the ruins and starvation that awaited in Japan. Or she could return to Japan, to a country in ruins, to a family that might not even recognize her. Japan had been devastated by the war, its cities bombed into rubble, its infrastructure destroyed, its people starving. Her mother was there alone and aging, not knowing if her daughter was alive or dead. Her homeland needed nurses desperately now, more than ever. The decision should have been simple. Logic pointed to America. Safety pointed to America. Self-interest pointed to America. But Yuki had never been guided by logic alone. She sought advice from Dr. Morrison, the man whose opinion she had come to trust above all others. What should I do? She asked him one evening, her English now much improved after months of practice. My heart is divided. Part of me wants to stay here where I have been treated so well, but part of me needs to go home, to my mother, to my people who are suffering. No, Morrison thought for a long moment before answering, removing his glasses and cleaning them carefully. I cannot tell you where to go, he said finally. That is a decision only you can make. But I can tell you this. Home is not always a place on a map. Sometimes home is where you are understood, where you are valued, where you can do the most good. He paused, choosing his words carefully. You have been given a second chance at life. The question is not where you will be most comfortable, but where you can use that gift to help others. Where can you turn your suffering into healing? Where can you teach what you have learned? Yuki understood then what her choice had to be. In the end, she chose to return to Japan. Her mother needed her. Her country, devastated by war, needed nurses more than ever. Children were dying of treatable diseases. Elderly people were starving in the ruins of cities. The wounded were suffering without care. She could not turn her back on that suffering, not after she herself had known suffering so intimately. But she promised herself that she would carry the lessons she had learned with her. She would not forget the Americans who had healed her. She would not forget that enemies could become saviors, that hatred could be transformed into understanding, that kindness was the most powerful force in the universe. The day of her departure arrived in October, a full year after her arrival. She stood at the San Francisco dock, where she had first been carried off the ship paralyzed and expecting death. Now she stood on her own 2 feet, using a cane for support, but walking, preparing to board the ship that would carry her home. The goodbyes were painful in a way she had not anticipated. Grace Kimura held her for a long moment, whispering in Japanese, "Your story needs to be told. Promise me you'll tell it. Promise me people will know what happened here." Yuki promised. Miller wheeled up to the gangway, looking uncomfortable with emotion. "You taught me something, Yuki," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "You taught me that forgiveness is possible, that we don't have to stay enemies, that healing is stronger than hatred." He pulled the American flag pin from his pocket, the one he had given her that night after donating blood, the one she had kept on her bedside table throughout her recovery. "Keep it," he said, pressing it back into her hand. "Remember us. Remember that even in the worst war, there can be mercy. There can be hope." Yuki nodded, unable to speak, clutching the pin tightly. Dr. Morrison was the last goodbye. They stood facing each other on the dock, the autumn wind blowing off the bay, the ship waiting behind them. "Write to me," Morrison said. "Let me know how you're doing. Let me know if the legs give you any trouble. Let me know how you're using what you learned to hear." "I will write every year," Yuki promised, her English clear, her accent still present, but her meaning unmistakable. "On the anniversary of my surgery, I will tell you everything." Morrison smiled, a tired smile, a smile that carried the weight of everything they had been through together. "You were my patient," he said, "but you became my proof. Proof that healing is the only victory that matters. Proof that mercy can triumph over vengeance. Proof that we can choose compassion, even when everything tells us to choose hate." They embraced, and Yuki felt the strength in his arms, the same strength that had guided the scalpel for 19 hours, the same strength that had refused to give up when others said the odds were impossible. "Thank you," she whispered, "for my legs, for my life, for showing me what humanity can be." "Thank you," Morrison replied, "for reminding me why I became a doctor, for showing me that healing transcends borders, for being brave enough to trust your enemies." Yuki walked up the gangway using her cane, but walking each step a testament to the miracle that had happened in that San Francisco hospital. She stood on the deck as the ship pulled away, watching the people who had saved her grow smaller in the distance. Helen waving with both hands, Grace standing with her hand over her heart, Miller in his wheelchair saluting, Morrison standing still, hands in his pockets, watching until the ship disappeared over the horizon. Yuki watched the Golden Gate Bridge grow smaller, watched San Francisco fade into the distance, watched America disappear behind her. But she carried it with her, in her legs that worked, in the pin clutched in her hand, in the lessons written on her heart. She arrived in Tokyo after weeks at sea to find a city of ashes. Buildings that had once touched the sky were now piles of rubble. Families lived in makeshift shelters constructed from debris. Children with hollow cheeks and desperate eyes wandered the streets, looking for food, for parents, for any scrap of hope. The air smelled of smoke and decay even months after the bombs had stopped falling. Her mother, aged beyond her years by worry and hardship, wept when she saw her daughter alive. They held each other for a long time in the ruins of what had once been their neighborhood, not speaking, just breathing in the miracle of reunion. Words were not necessary. Words could not contain the enormity of what they felt. Yuki went back to nursing immediately. She worked in hospitals that were overcrowded and undersupplied, where medicine was rationed and hope was scarce. She treated patients who had nothing, gave comfort to the dying, helped deliver babies into a world that was struggling to rebuild itself from the ashes. The work was exhausting, heartbreaking, and essential. And through it all, she remembered. She remembered the soup that had tasted like salvation. She remembered the nurses who had brushed her hair with such gentleness. She remembered the doctor who had operated for 19 hours to give her back her legs. She remembered the sergeant who had donated blood even though she was his enemy. She told these stories to anyone who would listen. At first, people did not believe her. Americans helping a Japanese prisoner. Impossible, the propaganda had been too effective. The hatred too deep. Surely she was confused. Surely she was lying. Surely the enemy could not have shown such mercy. But Yuki was living proof. She walked when doctors said she never would. She lived when she should have died. And the enemy, the monsters they had all been warned about, had made it possible. Slowly, painfully, people began to listen, began to believe, began to understand that perhaps the propaganda had been the lie, and Yuki's story was the truth. Yuki spent the rest of her life dedicated to healing and teaching. She eventually became an instructor at a nursing school in Osaka, training a new generation of caregivers. She instilled in her students the values she had learned in that American hospital, values that transcended nationality and politics and the artificial boundaries that humans construct between themselves. Every patient is a human being, she would tell them, standing before her classes, leaning slightly on the cane she still used on difficult days. It does not matter where they come from, what language they speak, what flag they were born under, or what they have done in their past. Your job is to heal. Your job is to show compassion. Your job is to be the light in their darkest moment. She would pause, looking at each student, making sure they understood. If you remember nothing else I teach you, remember this. Kindness is the most powerful medicine. Mercy is stronger than any surgical technique. And healing without judgment is the highest calling of our profession. She never saw Dr. Morrison again in person. The distance was too great, the demands of life too pressing. But she wrote to him every year on the anniversary of her surgery, just as she had promised. She told him about her life, her work, her students. She told him about the children she helped save, about the nurses she trained, about the small ways she tried to pass on the mercy he had shown her. And he wrote back every time, sharing stories of his own life, his own patience, his own hope for a world where healing could cross borders. His letters became treasures she kept in a wooden box beside her bed, reading them when the work grew hard, when the memories of the war grew heavy, when she needed to remember that goodness existed. When Dr. Morrison passed away in 1978, Yuki flew to America for his funeral. She was 56 years old, her hair now streaked with gray, but she walked into the church on legs he had saved, stronger now than they had been in decades. She stood before his family, his colleagues, the people who had known him best, and she spoke. Her English was fluent now after years of study, her voice clear and strong. He was my enemy, she said, her eyes sweeping across the gathered mourners. By the rules of war, by the logic of nations, we should have been on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. But Dr. Samuel Morrison saw past all of that. He saw a human being who was suffering, and he chose to help. Her voice grew stronger, more passionate. He taught me that kindness is the most powerful weapon in the world. It can defeat hatred. It can heal wounds that seem beyond repair. It can turn strangers into family. She paused, tears streaming down her face, but her voice never wavered. His hands gave me back my legs. His heart gave me back my faith in humanity. For 33 years, we wrote letters. He watched my life from across the ocean, celebrated my successes, encouraged me through difficulties. He never stopped caring. He never stopped believing that one act of mercy could change the world. She placed a single white flower on his casket, bowing deeply in the Japanese custom. And he was right, because I trained hundreds of nurses, and I taught every single one of them what he taught me. Heal without judgment. Show compassion without borders. Be the light in someone's darkest moment. She straightened, looking out at the mourners. He saved one woman's legs, but he saved thousands of people's hearts. His mercy multiplied through me, through my students, through their patients. Dr. Morrison's legacy is not measured in surgeries performed or papers published. It is measured in the ripples of compassion that continue to spread even now, even after his death. Yuki lived until she was 92 years old. In her final days in 2014, surrounded by her children and grandchildren in a peaceful room in Osaka, she spoke of the hospital in San Francisco, of the 19 hours that had changed her life. Her voice was weak, but her words were clear. I was paralyzed, she said, her eldest granddaughter holding her hand. Not just in my body, but in my heart. I could not believe that good existed in the world. I had seen too much cruelty, too much hatred, too much destruction. She smiled a peaceful smile, looking at the faces of her family gathered around her. And then they showed me. They showed me that even in the darkest times, light persists. Even among enemies, compassion survives. Even when everything else is broken, kindness endures. Her last words, whispered to her granddaughter, were simple but profound. Never let anyone tell you who to hate. The world will try. Governments will try. Fear will try. But you must find out for yourself. Look into the eyes of the person standing before you and see them for who they truly are. She squeezed her granddaughter's hand weakly. And always, always, in every moment you're given, choose kindness. That is my final lesson. That is my gift to you. She closed her eyes, a peaceful smile on her face, and slipped away quietly, surrounded by love, her work complete. Today, her granddaughter, Dr. Akiko Matsuda, works as an orthopedic surgeon in Tokyo. In her office hangs the American flag pin yellowed with age. Next to it, a photograph of a young woman standing with an American doctor in front of Letterman General Hospital, both smiling. And beside that, framed letters written in English and Japanese, spanning 33 years of friendship between a doctor and his patient. When people ask about the photograph, Akiko tells them the story. The story of mercy that crossed oceans. The story of 19 hours that proved humanity could triumph over hatred. The story of enemies who became family. And she ends with her grandmother's words, the lesson that defined Yuki Matsuda's life. The enemy is not the person standing before you. The enemy is the force that tells us we cannot show mercy, that we cannot heal our adversaries, that we must let hate guide our hands. But we can choose differently. We can choose to fight against that enemy with the most powerful weapon we have: compassion. Every step Yuki Matsuda took for 48 years on legs saved by an enemy was a testament to that choice. Every step was a victory over war. Every step was proof that mercy can break any chain, heal any wound, and bridge any divide. That is the legacy of 19 hours. That is the power of choosing healing over hatred. That is what makes us human. And that in the end is the only victory that truly matters.